The fluorescent lights of Northwestern Memorial Hospital's preoperative wing cast everything in that particular shade of sterile white that made Sarah Martinez's skin look pale against her charcoal business suit. She'd rushed here straight from her downtown marketing firm, her heels clicking against polished linoleum with the measured precision that had carried her through 16 years of raising Emma, her sister, her responsibility, her world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma sat on the examination table, her left knee wrapped in a temporary brace, dark hair falling across her face as she scrolled through her phone with practiced teenage indifference. At 16, she possessed that peculiar combination of street smarts and vulnerability that came from growing up in Chicago's elite private school system while living with the constant awareness that she was different from her classmates, not just because of her scholarship status, but because of something deeper she'd never been able to articulate. "I told you those basketball tryouts were too intense," Sarah said, adjusting Emma's hospital gown with the automatic care that had become second nature. "Your ACL tear could have been much worse." Emma's laugh held that familiar edge of humor she used to deflect concern. "Right, because sitting on the sidelines would have helped me make varsity. Besides, you worry about everything. Remember when I got food poisoning and you made me keep a symptom journal?" The comment struck Sarah oddly. She did worry, obsessively, some might say. Ever since their mother died when Sarah was 18 and Emma just 2, Sarah had felt this overwhelming need to protect her sister, to control every variable in their lives. Their stepfather, Dr. Richard Whitmore, had always said it was natural for Sarah to feel maternal toward Emma, given their age gap and the circumstances of their mother's death. But sitting here now, watching Emma's unconscious mimicry of Sarah's own gestures, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when nervous, the precise way she folded her hands, Sarah felt that familiar flutter of something she'd never been able to name. Dr. Patricia Chen entered with a clipboard and the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering routine medical information. "Emma Rodriguez, right? 16 years old, here for arthroscopic knee surgery? We just need to go over your preoperative blood work." "That's Emma Whitmore," Sarah corrected automatically. "Rodriguez was our mother's maiden name, but Emma's taken her father's name." Dr. Chen frowned at her chart, then looked between Sarah and Emma with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected puzzle. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion in our records. The blood typing we ran shows—" She paused, reviewing the papers again. "This is unusual. Could you both confirm your blood types for me?" Sarah's methodical nature kicked in, the same organizational instinct that had made her one of Chicago's most successful marketing executives. "I'm O negative. Emma is AB positive, like her father. Is there a problem with the surgical prep?" The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. Dr. Chen's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine confusion. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to double-check that information. According to these results, Emma is also O negative, and more than that," she hesitated, clearly outside her comfort zone. "The genetic markers we routinely screen for are showing a relationship pattern that doesn't match what you've described." Emma's phone had gone still in her hands. Sarah noticed, she always noticed everything about Emma, that her sister's breathing had changed. Not panicked, but alert in a way that reminded Sarah of a deer sensing danger. What kind of relationship pattern? Emma's voice was steady, but Sarah caught the undercurrent of something sharp and knowing. Dr. Chen looked between them again, then made a decision. "I think we need to run these tests again. There could be a lab error or a mix-up with samples. What I'm seeing here suggests—" She paused again, clearly uncomfortable. "It suggests a parent-child genetic relationship rather than siblings." The words hung in the sterile air like a challenge to reality itself. Sarah's world-class control, the armor she'd built through years of single-handedly managing both their lives, began to crack along invisible fault lines. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority she used in boardrooms. "Emma is my sister. Our mother gave birth to her when I was 18. I was there. I helped raise her from the time she was 2. But even as she spoke, memories flickered at the edges of her consciousness. The year she'd turned 17, the strange illness that had kept her out of school for months, the gaps in her memory that she'd always attributed to stress and grief over their mother's deteriorating health. The way their mother had looked at her sometimes, not with the exhaustion of terminal illness, but with something that looked almost like guilt. Emma was watching Sarah's face with that uncanny perception that had always unsettled their stepfather, Richard. "Sarah," she said quietly, "you know that thing you do when you're trying to solve a campaign problem? That face you make when the numbers don't add up but you can't figure out why?" Sarah's hand moved involuntarily to her cheek. She did have a particular expression when analyzing inconsistencies. Emma had teased her about it for years. "You're making that face right now," Emma continued, her teenage bravado softening into something more vulnerable. "And honestly, some part of me has been waiting my whole life for this conversation." The admission hit Sarah like physical impact. In the crowded hospital, surrounded by the anonymous bustle of urban life where thousands of personal dramas played out daily, she felt utterly alone with this impossible information. The city that had given her career success and carefully controlled independence now felt like a vast machine designed to hide truths that could shatter everything she thought she knew. "We need to call Richard," Sarah said, reaching for her phone with hands that weren't quite steady. "He'll know what to do. He's a doctor. He can explain this." But Emma's expression had shifted, and for a moment she looked older than 16, older than Sarah had ever seen her. "Sarah, when you call him, pay attention to how he reacts. Really pay attention." Dr. Chan was making notes, clearly trying to navigate an unprecedented situation. "I'm going to order a second round of blood work, and I'd like to suggest we postpone the surgery until we can resolve these questions. This kind of genetic relationship testing is quite accurate, but I understand this must be shocking." Sarah dialed Richard's private number, the one reserved for family emergencies. As it rang, she found herself studying Emma's face, really looking at her for perhaps the first time. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way her left eyebrow arched slightly higher than her right when she was thinking. Features Sarah saw every morning in her own mirror. "Richard Whitmore," came the smooth, authoritative voice that had guided their family through every crisis for the past 14 years. "Sarah, we're at Northwestern Memorial. There's been some kind of mistake with Emma's blood work. They're saying—" Sarah's voice faltered, the impossibility of the words stopping her. "Sarah, slow down. What exactly are they saying?" She looked at Emma, who was listening with that intensity she usually reserved for detecting adult lies. "They're saying that genetic markers show Emma and I have a parent-child relationship instead of siblings." The pause was brief but telling. When Richard spoke again, his voice carried a careful note of concern that somehow felt rehearsed. "That's obviously a laboratory error, Sarah. These things happen more often than you'd think. I'll make some calls, get this sorted out immediately. Don't let them upset Emma unnecessarily." As he continued talking, Sarah found herself analyzing his response with the same methodical attention she had used to deconstruct competitor strategies. Something in his tone felt wrong, too prepared, as if he'd been waiting for this call. Emma was still watching her, and in that moment, Sarah realized that her sister, her daughter, had been reading people and situations with sophistication far beyond her years. How many adult conversations had Emma been quietly analyzing, looking for the inconsistencies that Sarah was only now beginning to see? "We'll be home soon," Sarah told Richard, ending the call. But as she looked around the bustling hospital, she wondered if the home she'd carefully constructed, the life she'd methodically built for both of them, had been built on foundations that were already crumbling. The city beyond the hospital windows stretched out in all directions, millions of people carrying their own secrets through the anonymous streets. Somewhere in that urban maze were the answers to questions Sarah hadn't even known she needed to ask. Questions about memory gaps and teenage illnesses, about maternal instincts she'd attributed to sisterly responsibility, about the man who had guided their family through every decision for the past 14 years. Emma reached over and took her hand, a gesture that felt different now, charged with new meaning. "Whatever we find out, we'll figure it out together, right?" Sarah squeezed back, her marketing executive composure giving way to something more primal and protective. "Together," she agreed, though she wasn't sure if she was making a promise to her sister or to her daughter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to the personal earthquake occurring in examination room 314. But Sarah Martinez, who had spent 16 years believing she understood the fundamental facts of her own life, was beginning to realize that everything she thought she knew was about to change. The elevator ride to Sarah's downtown loft felt different now, the familiar hum of machinery underscoring a silence that had never existed between them before. Emma stood with her weight shifted off her injured knee, studying their reflection in the polished steel doors. Two faces that suddenly looked more alike than either had ever noticed. Sarah's minimalist apartment, typically her sanctuary of control with its clean lines and carefully curated art, felt exposed under Emma's new scrutiny. Everything here reflected Sarah's need for order. The marketing awards arranged by year, the color-coordinated bookshelves, the kitchen where every appliance had its designated place. It was the home of someone who controlled every variable because she'd never been able to control the big things. "You know," Emma said, settling onto the dove gray sectional with her leg elevated, "you always arranged everything in here like you were expecting an inspection. Now I'm wondering what you were really trying to control."
Before Sarah could respond, the intercom buzzed. Richard's voice, smooth and authoritative, filled the space. "Sarah? I came as soon as I could. We need to discuss this situation." Sarah's finger hesitated over the door release. In that pause, Emma's voice cut through the silence with startling clarity. "Before you let him up, ask yourself something. In all the family stories he's told us about Mom's pregnancy with me, has he ever mentioned being there for the birth? Or any of the prenatal appointments? Or even what hospital she delivered at?" The question hit Sarah like ice water. In 16 years of Richard's carefully constructed family narratives, those details had always been vague, attributed to her mother's desire for privacy during her illness. But now, with Emma's analytical gaze fixed on her, Sarah realized she'd never questioned the gaps. She buzzed him up anyway. Old habits died hard. Richard entered with the measured confidence that had always intimidated Sarah into compliance. At 52, he still carried the authoritative bearing that had made him one of Chicago's most respected physicians. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the emergency call, his charcoal suit wrinkle-free. Even in crisis, Dr. Richard Whitmore looked like someone who belonged on the Gold Coast's list of most influential residents. "This is exactly the kind of medical error that causes unnecessary family trauma," he began, setting down his leather briefcase with practiced precision. "I've already contacted the lab director at Northwestern. They're investigating the contamination that obviously occurred." Emma's laugh held no humor. "Contamination? Really? That's your medical opinion, Dad?" The way she said "Dad" carried a weight that made Richard's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Sarah caught it, another detail she'd been trained not to notice. "Emma, I understand you're upset, but these situations require calm analysis," Richard said, his tone carrying the patronizing edge he reserved for difficult patients. "Sarah, surely you remember the complications during your mother's pregnancy. The medications she was on could easily explain any genetic irregularities." But Sarah was remembering something else entirely. The spring of her 17th year, when she'd been sick for months with what Richard had diagnosed as severe stress-induced illness. The way her mother had started avoiding Richard's touches, sleeping in the guest room, whispering urgent phone conversations that stopped when Sarah entered the room. "What medications?" Emma asked, her street-smart instincts cutting through Richard's medical jargon. "And why don't I have any baby pictures from the hospital? Every other kid at school has those gross newborn photos, but somehow I don't have any." Richard's patient expression flickered. "Your mother was very private about medical situations. She didn't want those kinds of photos." Sarah found herself studying Richard's face with the same analytical intensity she brought to reading focus group reactions. Something in his micro-expressions felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared for this conversation long before today. The apartment's intercom buzzed again, and Carmen Vega's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sarah?"
"I brought wine and Chinese food. Figured you might need both after the hospital visit." Carmen's unexpected arrival felt like a lifeline. Sarah's best friend and former college roommate had an accountant's eye for inconsistencies and a complete inability to be intimidated by authority figures, traits that had always made Richard visibly uncomfortable. "Carmen," Richard said as she entered, his tone cooling noticeably. "How thoughtful." Carmen Vega looked like she'd stepped out of a forensic accounting textbook. Sharp business attire,
wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of focused intelligence that missed nothing. She'd built her career detecting financial fraud for Chicago's major corporations, a job that had honed her instinct for recognizing when numbers didn't add up. She set down the food and wine, then looked between Richard's too-perfect composure and the tension radiating from Sarah and Emma. "So," she said with characteristic directness, "someone want to explain why everyone looks like they've seen a ghost?" Richard launched into his prepared explanation about laboratory errors and medical complications. But Carmen's expression grew increasingly skeptical. Sarah watched her best friend's face transform into what she privately called audit mode, the cold, analytical stare that had uncovered embezzlement schemes and accounting fraud throughout the city's financial district. "Interesting," Carmen said when Richard finished. "And I'm sure you have documentation of these medical complications? Records from the treating physicians, insurance claims from the pregnancy?" Richard's pause was barely perceptible, but Carmen caught it. So did Emma. "Those records are confidential patient information," Richard said, his authority tinged with irritation. "Not from the patient herself," Carmen replied smoothly. "Sarah would have access to her own mother's medical records, especially as next of kin. I could help you request them. I know my way around Chicago's medical record systems pretty well." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah watched Richard's face carefully, using skills she developed in countless client meetings where reading subtext meant the difference between landing accounts and losing them. "That won't be necessary," Richard said. "I can provide any medical clarification Sarah needs." But Emma was leaning forward now, her injury forgotten. "Actually, I think it would be really interesting to see those records, especially the ones from around the time of my birth. Just to understand the family medical history better." Sarah felt something shift in the room's dynamic. For 16 years, Richard's medical authority had been unquestioned, his explanations accepted without challenge. But now, with Carmen's forensic instincts and Emma's sharp perception focused on the inconsistencies, his carefully constructed narratives were beginning to show cracks. "I think," Sarah said slowly, her voice carrying a new strength, "that we should look at those records. All of them." Richard's smile remained perfect, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Of course, Sarah. Family transparency is important. I'll make sure you have everything you need." But as he gathered his things to leave, Sarah caught Emma's expression. Her sister, daughter, was watching Richard with the analytical intensity of someone who'd spent years learning to read the adults around her for signs of deception. The door closed behind him, and Carmen immediately moved to the window, watching Richard's Mercedes pull away into Chicago's evening traffic. "Sarah," Carmen said without turning around, "I need you to think very carefully. In all the years I've known you, has Richard ever shown you a single piece of documentation about your family's medical history? Birth certificates, insurance records, hospital bills, anything with official letterhead?" The question hung in the pristine apartment like smoke, impossible to ignore. Sarah realized that in 16 years of trusting Richard's guidance, she had never seen a single official document that verified the story of their family's past. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Emma was watching her with eyes that seemed far too old for 16. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I think we need to start looking for answers that don't come from him." Sarah called her marketing firm at dawn, her voice steady as she requested an indefinite leave of absence. "Family emergency," she told her assistant, watching Emma sleep on the sectional where she'd insisted on staying the night. Even in sleep, Emma's face held that new alertness, as if her subconscious was processing the seismic shift in their reality. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sarah's loft illuminated dust motes that danced with the same chaotic energy she felt building in her chest. For 16 years, she'd thrived on marketing campaigns that required methodical research, competitor analysis, and strategic planning. Now she would apply those same skills to dismantling the carefully constructed fiction of her own life. Carmen arrived with coffee and a laptop bag that looked heavy enough to contain classified documents. "I've been up since 4, she announced, settling at Sarah's dining table with the focused intensity of someone about to conduct a financial audit. Started with the basics: birth certificates, hospital records, anything with a taper trail. Emma limped over, her knee injury forcing her to use the crutch Dr. Chen had provided. Despite the physical limitation, her eyes held a sharpness that reminded Sarah of herself during particularly complex campaign strategy sessions. "What did you find?" Emma asked, settling into the chair across from Carmen. Carmen opened her laptop, revealing spreadsheets that looked like battle plans. "Let's start with what we know versus what we can prove. Sarah, you remember being sick during your junior year of high school, right? Spring of 2007? The memory felt hazy, like trying to recall a dream. "I was out of school for almost 3 months. Some kind of stress-related illness," Richard said. "Mom was getting sicker, and I couldn't handle the pressure." "Interesting timeline," Carmen said, pulling up a calendar, because according to Cook County records, Emma's birth certificate lists her birth date as December 15th, 2007, which means your stress illness coincides almost exactly with what would have been a pregnancy. The words hit Sarah like physical impact. She found herself calculating dates with the same precision she'd used to analyze market demographics, and the numbers aligned with terrifying accuracy. Emma was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with a maturity that seemed to age her beyond her 16 years. "Sarah, you know how I've always been different at school. Not just the scholarship thing, but how I read people, how I can tell when adults are lying." Sarah nodded. Emma's perceptiveness had always been remarkable, sometimes uncomfortably so. "I think I learned that because I grew up in a house where the biggest adult was always lying about something. I just never knew what." Carmen pulled up another document. "There's more."
The fluorescent lights of Northwestern Memorial Hospital's preoperative wing cast everything in that particular shade of sterile white that made Sarah Martinez's skin look pale against her charcoal business suit. She'd rushed here straight from her downtown marketing firm, her heels clicking against polished linoleum with the measured precision that had carried her through 16 years of raising Emma, her sister, her responsibility, her world. Emma sat on the examination table, her left knee wrapped in a temporary brace, dark hair falling across her face as she scrolled through her phone with practiced teenage indifference. At 16, she possessed that peculiar combination of street smarts and vulnerability that came from growing up in Chicago's elite private school system while living with the constant awareness that she was different from her classmates, not just because of her scholarship status, but because of something deeper she'd never been able to articulate. "I told you those basketball tryouts were too intense," Sarah said, adjusting Emma's hospital gown with the automatic care that had become second nature. "Your ACL tear could have been much worse." Emma's laugh held that familiar edge of humor she used to deflect concern. "Right, because sitting on the sidelines would have helped me make varsity. Besides, you worry about everything. Remember when I had that food poisoning and you made me keep a symptom journal?" The comment struck Sarah oddly. She did worry, obsessively, some might say. Ever since their mother died when Sarah was 18 and Emma just 2, Sarah had felt this overwhelming need to protect her sister, to control every variable in their lives. Their stepfather, Dr. Richard Whitmore, had always said it was natural for Sarah to feel maternal toward Emma, given their age gap and the circumstances of their mother's death. But sitting here now, watching Emma's unconscious mimicry of Sarah's own gestures, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when nervous, the precise way she folded her hands, Sarah felt that familiar flutter of something she'd never been able to name. Dr. Patricia Chen entered with a clipboard and the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering routine medical information. "Emma Rodriguez, right? 16 years old, here for arthroscopic knee surgery. We just need to go over your preoperative blood work." "That's Emma Whitmore," Sarah corrected automatically. "Rodriguez was our mother's maiden name, but Emma has taken her father's name." Dr. Chen frowned at her chart, then looked between Sarah and Emma with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected puzzle. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion in our records. The blood typing we ran shows..." She paused, reviewing the papers again. "This is unusual. Could you both confirm your blood types for me?"
Maria made me promise to give you this if you ever came asking the right questions. She said you would know when it was time. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in her mother's familiar handwriting, dated just weeks before her death. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means you have discovered the truth I was too frightened to tell you while I lived. Richard took something from you that can never be returned. Your choice, your agency, your right to know your own child. Emma is yours, mi amor. Born from trauma, I pray you never fully remember, but carried in love, I know you feel, even if you don't understand why. The words blurred as Sarah continued reading, her mother's careful Spanish mixed with English, describing months of growing suspicion about Richard's treatment of teenage girls in his practice, about finding evidence of systematic abuse disguised as medical care. I tried to protect you, but I was already too sick, too dependent on him for my own care. By the time I understood what he had done, Emma was born and you believed she was your sister. I thought it might be kinder to let you believe the lie than to destroy you with the truth. I was wrong. Forgiveness is yours to give or withhold, but the truth belongs to you now. Emma had moved closer, reading over Sarah's shoulder. Her voice was steady, but tight with controlled emotion. So that's why I always felt different, not just from Dad, but from everything. I was living inside someone else's lie. Father Weigill's voice was heavy with years of carrying this burden. Your mother brought you to me when you were very small, Emma. She was terrified that Richard would try to continue his pattern. She made me promise to watch over both of you, to intervene if I ever suspected. But you never did, Sarah said, not accusingly, but with the exhaustion of someone realizing how many people had known pieces of her truth while she lived in carefully constructed ignorance. I was bound by confidentiality, and more shamefully, by my own cowardice. Richard Whitmore held significant influence over the medical community that served our parish. I told myself I was protecting the greater good, but I was protecting myself. Emma's analytical mind was working through the implications. If this is true, if Sarah is really my mother, then there should be medical records, hospital documentation, insurance claims, paper trails that even Richard couldn't completely erase. Carmen, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the conversation, looked up from her laptop. Actually, there are. I've been cross-referencing dates while you've been talking. Sarah, in March 2007, there are several large insurance claims under your policy. Emergency room visits, extended hospital stays, all coded as complications from a gynecological procedure. The clinical language felt like ice in Sarah's veins. She closed her eyes, trying to reach for memories that felt wrapped in cotton and shadow. Images flickered at the edges of her consciousness. Sterile rooms, Richard's voice explaining why she needed to trust him, her mother crying in the hallway outside a door she couldn't quite remember. I can't remember, she whispered.
There are pieces, but they're like trying to grab water. Father Miguel leaned forward with the gentleness of someone accustomed to hearing confessions of unthinkable pain. Sometimes the mind protects us from memories too terrible to carry. But sometimes, with the right help, we can choose to remember in a way that gives us power instead of destroying us. Emma's hand found Sarah's, her grip surprisingly strong. You don't have to remember anything you're not ready for. But if you want to, if you think it would help us stop him from hurting anyone else, I'll be right there with you. The offer hung in the small office like a bridge between the past they'd believed and the future they might choose. Sarah looked at her daughter, the word felt more natural each time she thought it, and saw not just Emma's perceptiveness and strength, but her own determination reflected back. Dr. Amara Okafor, Carmen said, consulting her notes. She specializes in recovered memory therapy at Northwestern Memorial. Excellent reputation, testified in several high-profile cases involving medical abuse. I could call her. Sarah nodded slowly. Make the appointment. But Emma, you don't have to be part of this process if you don't want to. This is about things that happened to me before you were even conscious. Emma's smile held traces of the humor she used to deflect pain, but underneath was something fierce and protective.
Sarah, you've been taking care of me for 16 years without even knowing I was yours to protect. The least I can do is help you figure out how to take care of yourself. As they prepared to leave Sacred Heart Parish, Father Miguel pressed something small into Sarah's hand, a medal of St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes. Your mother asked me to give you this when the time came. She said to tell you that no cause is truly lost if there's still someone willing to fight for the truth. Walking back to Carmen's car, Sarah felt the weight of the medal in her palm and the larger weight of 16 years of suppressed memories pressing against her consciousness. The Chicago skyline stretched before them, full of institutions and systems that had enabled Richard's crimes through willful blindness or active complicity. But for the first time since the hospital revelation, Sarah felt like she was choosing her next steps instead of simply reacting to someone else's manipulation. The truth was going to hurt. She could feel it gathering like a storm at the edges of her memory, but Emma was right beside her, and that made all the difference. Dr. Amara Okafor's office in Northwestern Memorial's psychiatric wing felt deliberately different from the rest of the hospital. Soft lighting instead of fluorescence, comfortable chairs instead of examination tables, artwork that suggested healing rather than clinical efficiency. Sarah sat across from the psychiatrist, Emma in the adjacent chair, despite Sarah's repeated offers to do this alone. Dr. Okafor was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and the kind of presence that invited trust without demanding it. She'd reviewed Father Miguel's letter and Carmen's preliminary financial documentation before their session, approaching Sarah's case with the methodical care of someone who understood that recovered memories could be both evidence and weapons. "I want to be clear about something from the start," Dr. Okafor said, her voice carrying both warmth and authority. "Memory recovery isn't about finding a predetermined truth. It's about allowing your mind to process experiences it protected you from when they occurred. Whatever we discover, it will be your truth, not someone else's interpretation of it." Sarah nodded, her marketing background helping her appreciate the careful positioning. "I understand. But I need to know what happened, not just for me, but for Emma, and possibly for other people Richard might have hurt."
The first session yielded only fragments, impressions of being very sick, of Richard's voice explaining medical procedures she was too young to understand, of her mother's face streaked with tears. But as the weeks progressed, the pieces began forming a coherent and devastating picture. The breakthrough came during their fourth session, when Dr. Okafor guided Sarah through a relaxation technique that allowed her to approach the memories from a place of safety rather than trauma. "I'm 17, Sarah heard herself saying, her voice sounding younger than it had in years. "I'm supposed to be getting better, but I feel wrong inside, different. Richard says it's normal, that the medication is working, but something feels—" She paused, her breathing becoming shallow. "Emma, can you hold my hand?" Emma's grip was immediate and firm. "I'm right here. You're safe." The memory unfolded like a photograph developing in slow motion. Richard's private examination room, not at his main practice, but somewhere smaller, more discreet. Sarah being told she needed a procedure to help with her hormonal imbalances. The mask over her face, Richard's voice saying she wouldn't remember anything uncomfortable. "He said I wouldn't remember," Sarah whispered, tears starting to fall. "But I do remember waking up. I remember feeling different, and him telling me it was normal side effects from the treatment. I remember asking why I felt nauseous in the mornings, and him saying it was part of getting better." Dr. Okafor's voice was gentle but grounding. "Sarah, you're safe now. You're remembering from a place of strength, not vulnerability. What else do you remember?" "Months of being told I was getting better while feeling worse. Mom started asking questions, started wanting to see my medical records, and Richard said she was too sick to understand complex medical situations." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued processing memories that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. "I remember holding you," Sarah said to Emma, her voice soft with wonder. "Just once, right after you were born. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And then Richard took you away and said it was better if I didn't get too attached since I wasn't ready to be a mother." Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But you were attached anyway. That's why you've always been so protective, why you worry about everything I do. Maternal instinct doesn't disappear just because someone tells you it should, Dr. Okafor observed. Sarah, your mind may have accepted Richard's narrative intellectually, but your heart never stopped knowing the truth. After the session, they met Carmen at Marcus Thompson's office in Chinatown. The private investigator's workspace looked like something from a noir film. Case files stacked on every surface, a city map covered with pins marking locations relevant to Richard's career, and evidence boards that made Carmen's spreadsheets look simple by comparison. Marcus Thompson was exactly what Sarah had expected from Carmen's description. Mid-50s, weathered face that had seen too much, and eyes that missed nothing. His small office felt cramped with 4 people, but his attention to detail was immediately apparent in the way he'd organized their preliminary evidence. "What you've recovered today is crucial," he said after they'd shared Dr. Okafor's session notes, "but recovered memories alone won't be enough to build a criminal case. We need corroborating evidence, and we need to establish a pattern that shows this wasn't an isolated incident." Carmen opened her laptop, displaying financial records that looked like detective work. "I've been tracing Richard's practice locations and cross-referencing them with unusual insurance claims. There are at least 6 other cases that show similar patterns. Young women from low-income families, extended treatments for vague conditions, and sudden relocations when questions started being asked." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good work. I've been working my contacts in the department, and Richard's name has come up in 3 separate investigations over the past decade. Never enough evidence to prosecute, but enough smoke to suggest fire." Emma, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, suddenly spoke up. "What if we could get him to admit it? What if there was a way to record him talking about what he did?" The room went quiet as everyone considered the implications. Marcus's expression was carefully neutral. "That would be dangerous, Emma, and legally complicated. Illinois is a 2-party consent state for recordings." "But," Carmen said slowly, "if Sarah confronted him in a public place, somewhere with security cameras, and if she could get him to react in a way that revealed his guilt..." Sarah felt something cold and determined settling in her chest. "He's been controlling the narrative of my life for 16 years. Maybe it's time I controlled a conversation with him." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his detective instincts clearly warring with his protective impulses. "If you're serious about this, we need to plan it carefully. Richard isn't just a predator. He's a smart predator who has avoided consequences for decades. He won't go down easily."
Emma's hand found Sarah's again, their connection now carrying the weight of shared truth rather than assumed fiction. "Whatever we do it together. He stole 16 years of you being my mother. I'm not letting him steal one more day." As they left Marcus's office, Sarah felt the pieces of a larger picture beginning to form. Richard's crimes weren't random acts of opportunism. They were part of a systematic pattern of exploitation that had thrived in Chicago's complex medical system. But for the first time since learning the truth, she felt like she had allies who understood both the scope of the challenge and the stakes involved. The city evening was settling around them, and somewhere in its vast anonymity, Richard Whitmore was continuing his carefully constructed life, unaware that the family he'd manipulated for 16 years was finally ready to fight back. The first sign that Richard knew they were investigating came through Emma's school. Sarah was reviewing Marcus's evidence boards in her loft when Emma burst through the door, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like betrayal. "They want to meet with you," Emma announced, dropping her backpack with unusual force. "The school counselor, the headmaster, and some woman from social services. Apparently there are concerns about my home stability and whether I'm receiving appropriate care during this family crisis." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. What exactly did they say? Emma's voice took on the measured tone she used when repeating adult conversations word for word. "Miss Peterson said they'd received information suggesting that my guardian might be experiencing some kind of mental health episode involving false memories and conspiracy theories about my father. They want to discuss temporary placement options for my own protection." The clinical precision of the attack was unmistakably Richard's work. Sarah recognized his strategy from years of watching him navigate medical politics. Undermine the credibility of anyone who might threaten him, use institutional authority to isolate his targets, and position himself as the reasonable adult protecting vulnerable people from unstable influences.
Carmen arrived within minutes of Sarah's panicked phone call, her forensic accountant instincts immediately recognizing a coordinated campaign. "This isn't random," she announced, setting up her laptop on Sarah's dining table. "I've been monitoring your professional reputation online, and there's been a systematic effort to plant questions about your mental stability." She pulled up search results that made Sarah's blood run cold. Anonymous posts on professional networking sites questioning Sarah's recent behavior suggested concerns about her fitness for client responsibilities. Carefully worded inquiries about whether her marketing firm was aware of her family difficulties. It's subtle, but effective. Nothing actionable as libel, but enough to create doubt. Classic reputation management strategy, except instead of protecting a brand, he's destroying yours. Emma was pacing despite her injured knee, her analytical mind working through the implications. He's not just trying to discredit Sarah's memories, he's trying to make it look like she's an unfit guardian who's manipulating me with delusions. The realization hit Sarah like physical impact. If he can get social services to remove you from my care, if he can position himself as your only stable family member, then any testimony I give becomes the words of a confused teenager who's been influenced by an unstable adult, Emma finished. And any evidence we've gathered becomes the product of someone who's clearly having a psychological break. Sarah's phone rang, and Richard's name appeared on the screen. She looked at Emma and Carmen, then activated speaker mode. "Sarah, I've been hearing concerning things about your behavior lately. Emma's school contacted me about some troubling conversations she's been having. I think we need to discuss getting you some professional help."
The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that Sarah could hear why it had worked for 16 years. But now, with Emma and Carmen watching her face, she recognized it for what it was. "What kind of professional help, Richard?" "There are excellent facilities that specialize in trauma-related memory disorders, the kind of therapy that helps people distinguish between real experiences and constructed narratives. I've already spoken with several colleagues about your case." Emma made a gesture that Sarah interpreted as "keep him talking," and she understood they were documenting this conversation for Marcus. "My case?" Sarah repeated. "Sarah, you've convinced yourself that you're Emma's mother based on what can only be described as false memories encouraged by unqualified individuals. I'm concerned that your mental state is affecting Emma's well-being." "And what would you recommend for Emma's well-being?" Richard's pause was brief but telling. "Emma needs stability during this difficult time. I think it would be best if she stayed with me until you've received proper treatment. I've already discussed this with the appropriate authorities." After ending the call, the three women sat in Sarah's loft feeling the weight of Richard's next move settling around them like a trap. Emma was the first to break the silence. "He's good," she said with grudging admiration for the strategy, if not the strategist. "Attack Sarah's credibility, position himself as the concerned family member, use institutional authority to separate us so we can't support each other's testimony." Carmen was already typing furiously. But he made a mistake. He said he'd, quote, "already discussed this with the appropriate authorities." That suggests coordination, planning. This isn't a spontaneous response to concerning behavior, it's a premeditated campaign. Sarah felt something shifting inside her, the same cold determination she'd used to win impossible marketing campaigns against better-funded competitors. He's treating this like a medical case he can manage through proper procedures and authority, but I'm not his patient anymore, and this isn't a hospital where he controls the narrative. Emma's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're going to fight this like a campaign, aren't you?" "Exactly. He's used to winning through institutional authority and professional reputation, but I've spent my career defeating competitors who had more resources and better connections. The difference is, this time it's personal." Carmen closed her laptop with satisfaction. "I've been documenting every financial irregularity in his practice for the past 15 years. If he wants to play hardball, we have ammunition." Emma moved to the window overlooking the city, her reflection showing a teenager who looked older than her 16 years. "There's something else we should consider. If Richard is this worried about us exposing him, if he's willing to use social services and professional reputation as weapons, then we're probably not his only victims." The observation hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah joined Emma at the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, where millions of people carried their own secrets and traumas. Marcus said there were other cases, Sarah said slowly. Other young women, other families he manipulated. Then maybe it's time we found them, Emma replied. Richard's strength has always been isolating his victims, making them think they're alone. But what if they're not alone anymore? As evening settled over the city, Sarah felt the campaign strategy crystallizing in her mind. Richard had declared war using institutional authority and professional reputation as weapons, but he'd underestimated both her strategic skills and the power of truth when it finally had allies willing to fight for it. The battle for Emma's custody and Sarah's credibility was just the opening move. The real war was going to be fought in courtrooms and media coverage, with evidence boards and witness testimony, until every one of Richard's victims had the chance to reclaim the truth that had been stolen from them.
The Gold Coast Medical Building, where Richard maintained his practice, rose 30 floors above Michigan Avenue, its glass and steel facade reflecting the kind of institutional power that had protected him for decades. Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside, Emma beside her despite every argument about staying somewhere safe, while Marcus positioned himself across the street with recording equipment that would capture everything happening in Richard's corner office. Carmen was monitoring Richard's financial accounts from her car, ready to document any sudden transfers that might indicate flight preparation. Dr. Okafor waited at Northwestern Memorial, prepared to provide professional support if Sarah's confrontation triggered traumatic memory episodes. Father Miguel had offered prayers and the reminder that truth, however painful, was always sacred. "You don't have to do this," Emma said quietly, adjusting her grip on the crutch she still needed for her injured knee. "We have enough evidence for Marcus to involve law enforcement." Sarah looked up at the building's imposing height, then at her daughter. The word no longer felt strange, only right. For 16 years, he's controlled every conversation about our family, our history, our reality. This is my chance to control one conversation with him. The elevator ride to the 28th floor felt like ascending toward a reckoning that had been 16 years in the making. Sarah's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who looked different than she had just weeks ago, still professional, still composed, but carrying a strength that came from finally understanding the source of her lifelong anxiety. Richard's practice occupied an entire corner of the building, all mahogany furniture and medical diplomas that spoke of respectable authority. His receptionist, a middle-aged woman who'd clearly been trained to manage difficult situations, looked uncomfortable when Sarah announced she needed to speak with Dr. Whitmore immediately. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Whitmore is with patients today. If you'd like to schedule..." "Tell him Sarah Martinez is here with Emma, and we need to discuss the social services investigation he initiated." The receptionist's expression shifted, professional courtesy giving way to something that looked like recognition. She spoke quietly into her phone, then gestured toward Richard's private office. Richard sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a conference table, every element of his office designed to intimidate patients into compliance. At 52, he still projected the kind of authority that made questioning him feel like questioning medicine itself. But Sarah was no longer the 17-year-old girl who'd trusted him with her health or the 18-year-old who'd accepted his explanations about family structure. "Sarah, Emma, I'm glad you've come. We need to discuss getting you appropriate help." Emma settled into the chair beside Sarah, her presence radiating the kind of support that comes from shared truth rather than shared delusion. "Actually, Dad, we're here to discuss you getting appropriate consequences." Richard's smile remained perfectly professional, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Emma, I understand you're confused right now. Sarah has been filling your head with impossible stories based on recovered memories that have no basis in medical reality." Sarah leaned forward, using the boardroom posture that had won her difficult clients. She spoke quietly, but she couldn't ignore the tremor in her voice.
"Richard, I remember everything now.
The private examination room, the procedures you told me I wouldn't remember, the months of being told I was being treated for stress while I was actually pregnant. Sarah, what you're describing is a trauma-induced false memory syndrome. It's more common than you might think, especially in cases involving family stress and loss. But Emma was watching Richard's face with the analytical intensity she'd learned from 16 years of reading adults for signs of deception. That's interesting, because you haven't asked what specific procedures Sarah remembers, or what dates she's talking about, or any of the details you'd need to verify whether her memories match your medical records. The observation landed like a surgical strike. Richard's professional composure flickered, and for a moment, Sarah saw something predatory surface in his expression. Emma, you're 16 years old. You don't understand the complexities of medical diagnoses or the psychological factors that can create convincing but false narratives. I understand that you just tried to use my age to dismiss evidence instead of addressing it, Emma replied evenly, which is exactly what predators do when their victims start talking. The word predators hung in the office like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Richard's mask began to slip, revealing the calculating manipulator who'd built his career on vulnerable young women. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Richard said, his voice losing its carefully modulated professional tone. Do you think anyone will believe the fantasies of an unstable woman and a confused teenager over the word of a respected physician? Sarah felt something click into place, the same strategic clarity that had made her successful at reading market dynamics and competitor weaknesses. Actually, Richard, we're not asking anyone to believe anything. We're simply documenting what you say when you think you're still in control of the narrative. Richard's eyes narrowed as he processed the implication. This conversation is privileged medical discussion. Recording it would be illegal. We're not in a treatment relationship, Sarah said with satisfaction, and you just admitted that you've been using your medical reputation to cover up criminal behavior. The realization that he'd been outmaneuvered transformed Richard's expression completely. The caring stepfather facade disappeared, replaced by someone who'd spent decades manipulating systems to protect himself from consequences. You have no idea what you're trying to destroy, he said, his voice carrying a threat that made Sarah's protective instincts flare. My practice serves this community. My colleagues trust me. My patients depend on me. If you pursue this delusional crusade, you'll destroy more than just my reputation. Your patients, Sarah repeated, standing up with the kind of authority she'd never been able to access as his stepdaughter or patient. How many other patients, Richard? How many other young women have you treated for mysterious illnesses that left them with gaps in their memory? Richard's silence was answer enough. Emma struggled to her feet, her injured knee forcing her to lean on Sarah for support, a gesture that suddenly felt like the most natural thing in the world. We're done here. Sarah and I are going to spend the rest of our lives making sure your patients are safe from you. As they moved toward the door, Richard's voice stopped them, carrying the kind of cold calculation that revealed his true nature. Sarah, if you continue this path, I will destroy you professionally, personally, and legally. I have connections throughout this city that you can't imagine. I will make sure you never work in marketing again, never have credibility in any professional setting, never have custody of Emma.
Sarah turned back to face him, and for the first time in 16 years, she looked at Richard Whitmore without fear. Richard, you made one crucial mistake. You taught me to be methodical, strategic, and thorough. Now I'm going to use those skills against you. The elevator doors closed behind them, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before her 17th birthday, complete clarity about her own power and the right to use it. The Cook County Courthouse steps were slick with October rain when Sarah and Emma arrived for Richard's arraignment, pushing through a crowd of reporters that had materialized seemingly overnight. Zoe Kim's investigative series in the Chicago Tribune, The Doctor's Pattern, how Chicago's medical elite enabled systematic abuse had transformed their private pain into a public reckoning that neither of them had anticipated. Miss Martinez, can you comment on the charges against Dr. Whitmore? Emma, how does it feel to learn your father isn't actually your father? Is it true that recovered memories are unreliable evidence? Emma gripped Sarah's arm tighter, her street-smart composure holding despite the chaos. "This is insane," she murmured as they pushed toward the courthouse entrance. Inside, Marcus Thompson met them with grim satisfaction etched across his weathered face. "3 more women came forward overnight," he reported quietly. "All similar patterns. Young, vulnerable, treated by Richard for vague conditions involving memory gaps and unexplained medical procedures." Sarah felt something settle in her chest that was both vindication and horror. Being right about Richard's crimes meant accepting that their family's trauma was part of a much larger pattern of predation. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, Richard's medical colleagues filling one side, while victims' advocates and journalists occupied the other. Richard entered in an expensive suit that projected professional respectability, flanked by attorneys who looked like they charged more per hour than most people made in a month. Judge Patricia Hernandez, a woman in her 60s with the kind of presence that demanded respect, called the proceeding to order. As the charges were read aloud, sexual assault, fraud, child endangerment, practicing medicine without proper consent, Sarah watched Richard's face remain perfectly composed, as if he were listening to someone else's case. "The defendant has been charged with multiple felonies spanning a 15-year period," the prosecutor announced. "We have evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse targeting vulnerable young women, financial fraud to cover medical procedures that were never properly consented to, and the manipulation of family structures to hide criminal activity." Richard's lead attorney, a silver-haired man whose reputation for defending white-collar criminals was legendary in Chicago legal circles, stood with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, my client is a respected physician who has served this community for decades. These charges are based primarily on recovered memories, which the medical community widely recognizes as unreliable, and the testimony of individuals who have clear motivations to fabricate accusations." Emma's hand found Sarah's as they listened to their trauma being dismissed as fabrication and revenge fantasy. But Sarah had spent enough years in competitive business environments to recognize defensive positioning when she heard it. The bail hearing revealed the true scope of Richard's connections. Character witnesses included hospital administrators, medical school professors, and community leaders who testified to his reputation and community ties. The prosecution argued he was a flight risk, presenting evidence of offshore accounts Carmen had uncovered and documentation of multiple passport applications under various spellings of his name. Judge Patricia Hernandez set bail at $2 million, her expression suggesting she found both sides' arguments problematic. This case raises complex questions about memory, medical ethics, and institutional responsibility that will require careful consideration. Until trial, Dr. Whitmore's medical license is suspended, and he is prohibited from contact with any alleged victims or their families. Outside the courthouse, Zoe Kim approached them with the focused intensity that had made her investigation so thorough. "Sarah, Emma, would you be willing to make a statement? Your story has encouraged other victims to come forward, and the public deserves to understand the scope of what happened." Sarah looked at Emma, who nodded with the kind of maturity that continued to surprise her. They stood together on the courthouse steps, facing cameras that would broadcast their words across the city and beyond.
"I was told I was Emma's sister, that our family structure was normal, that my memory gaps and anxiety were just personality traits. Learning the truth has been devastating, but staying silent would betray other women who may still be trapped in similar situations." Emma stepped closer to the microphones, her voice carrying despite her youth. "I want other kids who feel like something isn't right in their families to know they can trust their instincts. Adults aren't always telling the truth, even when they're supposed to be protecting you. Especially when they're supposed to be protecting you." The questions that followed were intense and sometimes invasive, but Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since this began: control over her own narrative. For years, Richard had managed every story about their family. Now, finally, she was telling her own version. That evening, watching the news coverage from Sarah's loft, they saw how the story was being framed. Some outlets focused on the medical ethics angles, others on the legal questions surrounding recovered memory testimony. But Zoe's reporting had done something more important. It had connected Richard's case to broader patterns of institutional protection for predators. "Look at this," Emma said, scrolling through social media responses to the coverage. Women are sharing stories about their own experiences with doctors who made them feel uncomfortable, situations where they were told not to trust their own perceptions. Carmen arrived with Chinese takeout and updates from her financial investigation. Richard's legal team is expensive, but they're not getting paid from his regular accounts. Someone else is funding his defense, and I think I know who. She spread documents across Sarah's dining table, showing wire transfers from a foundation associated with Chicago's most prestigious medical institutions. It's not just about protecting Richard anymore. It's about protecting an entire system that enabled him. The revelation felt like another layer of betrayal. Richard's crimes weren't just personal violations. They were symptoms of institutional failures that prioritized reputation over patient safety. Emma was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the kind of clarity that had been guiding them through this entire process. "So, we're not just fighting Richard anymore. We're fighting everyone who helped him hide what he was doing." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of what they'd undertaken settling around them like armor. The legal battle would be long and public, their lives dissected by strangers, their trauma examined under harsh lights. But for the first time since learning the truth, she felt like they were fighting from a position of strength rather than defending from a place of vulnerability. The city stretched out beyond her windows, full of institutions and individuals who would now have to choose between protecting their reputations or enabling justice. The outcome was far from certain, but Sarah Martinez, mother, survivor, fighter, was finally ready for whatever came next. The Wisconsin Retreat Center sat nestled among October maples, their leaves turning brilliant red and gold in the kind of natural display that Chicago's urban landscape could never match. Father Miguel's family had owned this land for 3 generations, and the simple cabins scattered around a small lake offered the kind of anonymity that had become precious since the media attention began. Sarah stood on the cabin's small deck, watching Emma navigate the uneven lakeside path with her crutch, her injured knee finally healing properly after weeks of stress and courthouse appearances. The silence here felt different from the oppressive quiet of suppressed secrets. This was the peaceful quiet of truth finally having space to breathe. Dr. O'Coffer's voice came through Sarah's laptop speakers, their video therapy sessions continuing even in this remote location. "How are you both adjusting to having space from the media attention?" Emma settled into the chair beside Sarah, her face showing a relaxation that had been absent since the courthouse proceedings began. "It's weird, but good weird. Like, I keep waiting for someone to ask me how it feels to discover my sister as my mother, or whether I'm angry about being lied to for 16 years. And how do you feel about those things?" Dr. O'Coffer asked gently. Emma was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the lake where early morning mist was just beginning to lift. "I'm not angry at Sarah. She was as much a victim as I was. Maybe more, because she lost 16 years of knowing she was my mother."
"I was told I was Emma's sister, that our family structure was normal, that my memory gaps and anxiety were just personality traits. Learning the truth has been devastating, but staying silent would betray other women who may still be trapped in similar situations." Emma stepped closer to the microphones, her voice carrying despite her youth. "I want other kids who feel like something isn't right in their families to know they can trust their instincts. Adults aren't always telling the truth, even when they're supposed to be protecting you. Especially when they're supposed to be protecting you." The questions that followed were intense and sometimes invasive, but Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since this began: control over her own narrative. For years, Richard had managed every story about their family. Now, finally, she was telling her own version. That evening, watching the news coverage from Sarah's loft, they saw how the story was being framed. Some outlets focused on the medical ethics angles, others on the legal questions surrounding recovered memory testimony.
But Zoe's reporting had done something more important. It had connected Richard's case to broader patterns of institutional protection for predators. "Look at this," Emma said, scrolling through social media responses to the coverage. Women are sharing stories about their own experiences with doctors who made them feel uncomfortable, situations where they were told not to trust their own perceptions. Carmen arrived with Chinese takeout and updates from her financial investigation. Richard's legal team is expensive, but they're not getting paid from his regular accounts. Someone else is funding his defense, and I think I know who. She spread documents across Sarah's dining table, showing wire transfers from a foundation associated with Chicago's most prestigious medical institutions. It's not just about protecting Richard anymore. It's about protecting an entire system that enabled him. The revelation felt like another layer of betrayal. Richard's crimes weren't just personal violations. They were symptoms of institutional failures that prioritized reputation over patient safety. Emma was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the kind of clarity that had been guiding them through this entire process. "So, we're not just fighting Richard anymore. We're fighting everyone who helped him hide what he was doing." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of what they'd undertaken settling around them like armor. The legal battle would be long and public, their lives dissected by strangers, their trauma examined under harsh lights. But for the first time since learning the truth, she felt like they were fighting from a position of strength rather than defending from a place of vulnerability. The city stretched out beyond her windows, full of institutions and individuals who would now have to choose between protecting their reputations or enabling justice. The outcome was far from certain, but Sarah Martinez, mother, survivor, fighter, was finally ready for whatever came next. The Wisconsin Retreat Center sat nestled among October maples, their leaves turning brilliant red and gold in the kind of natural display that Chicago's urban landscape could never match. Father Miguel's family had owned this land for 3 generations, and the simple cabins scattered around a small lake offered the kind of anonymity that had become precious since the media attention began. Sarah stood on the cabin's small deck, watching Emma navigate the uneven lakeside path with her crutch, her injured knee finally healing properly after weeks of stress and courthouse appearances. The silence here felt different from the oppressive quiet of suppressed secrets. This was the peaceful quiet of truth finally having space to breathe. Dr. O'Coffer's voice came through Sarah's laptop speakers, their video therapy sessions continuing even in this remote location. "How are you both adjusting to having space from the media attention?" Emma settled into the chair beside Sarah, her face showing a relaxation that had been absent since the courthouse proceedings began. "It's weird, but good weird. Like, I keep waiting for someone to ask me how it feels to discover my sister as my mother, or whether I'm angry about being lied to for 16 years. And how do you feel about those things?" Dr. O'Coffer asked gently. Emma was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the lake where early morning mist was just beginning to lift. "I'm not angry at Sarah. She was as much a victim as I was. Maybe more, because she lost 16 years of knowing she was my mother."
Emma set down her pen and looked at Sarah with the kind of direct honesty that had characterized their relationship since learning the truth. "I want to testify, not because I have to, but because I want other kids in situations like mine to see that you can stand up to adults who abuse their power." Sarah nodded slowly, pride and fear warring in her chest. "Then we'll testify together, as mother and daughter, finally." As autumn deepened around the retreat center, Sarah felt herself changing in ways that went deeper than simply accepting new information about her past. The anxiety that had shadowed her for decades was lifting, replaced by a clarity of purpose that felt both foreign and entirely natural. Emma was changing too, growing into someone who understood her own power while retaining the perceptiveness and humor that had always defined her. They were becoming a family based on choice and truth, rather than manipulation and lies. The legal battle would continue, the media attention would persist, and the work of holding Richard and his enablers accountable was far from finished. But here beside a Wisconsin lake,
Watching her daughter plan her future with the confidence of someone who finally knew her own history, Sarah Martinez felt something she'd never experienced before: the peace of living authentically in her own life. The Wisconsin Retreat Center sat nestled among October maples, their leaves turning brilliant red and gold in the kind of natural display that Chicago's urban landscape could never match. Father Miguel's family had owned this land for 3 generations, and the simple cabins scattered around a small lake offered the kind of anonymity that had become precious since the media attention began. Sarah stood on the cabin's small deck, watching Emma navigate the uneven lakeside path with her crutch, her injured knee finally healing properly after weeks of stress and courthouse appearances. The silence here felt different from the oppressive quiet of suppressed secrets. This was the peaceful quiet of truth, finally having space to breathe. Dr. Okafor's voice came through Sarah's laptop speakers, their video therapy sessions continuing even in this remote location. How are you both adjusting to having space from the media attention? Emma settled into the chair beside Sarah, her face showing a relaxation that had been absent since the courthouse proceedings began. It's weird, but good weird. Like, I keep waiting for someone to ask me how it feels to discover my sister is my mother, or whether I'm angry about being lied to for 16 years. And how do you feel about those things? Dr. Okafor asked gently. Emma was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the lake where early morning mist was just beginning to lift. I'm not angry at Sarah. She was as much a victim as I was, maybe more because she lost 16 years of knowing she was my mother. I'm angry at Richard, and I'm angry at everyone who knew something was wrong but didn't do anything about it. Sarah felt that familiar flutter of protective instinct, stronger now that she understood its true source. Emma's been having nightmares again, not about hospitals this time, but about the trial, about having to testify. Dr. Okafor nodded with understanding. Public testimony about private trauma is incredibly difficult. Emma, you should know that your participation in the legal proceedings is your choice. You've already contributed significantly to the case. But if I don't testify, Richard might not be convicted, Emma said, her voice carrying the weight of responsibility that Sarah recognized from her own teenage years. Other victims are depending on this case to get justice. The burden of being a symbol as well as a survivor was something Sarah Martinez understood intimately now. Since Zoe Kim's articles had gone national, they'd received hundreds of letters from other families dealing with similar situations: medical professionals who had exploited their authority, institutions that had protected predators, children who'd grown up sensing something wrong but unable to articulate what. We don't have to decide about testimony today, Sarah said, reaching for Emma's hand. Right now, we're just 2 people learning how to be mother and daughter instead of sisters.
The statement would have felt impossible just months ago, but here in the quiet of the retreat center, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Their days had developed a rhythm that felt healing in its simplicity. Morning coffee on the deck while Emma worked on the college application essays that had been interrupted by the investigation. Afternoon walks around the lake where they talked about everything except Richard and legal proceedings. Evening conversations about Emma's future, about Sarah's career plans, about the kind of relationship they wanted to build on foundations of truth rather than deception. I've been thinking about changing my name, Emma announced during one of these evening talks, her voice carrying the kind of careful consideration she brought to all major decisions. Legally, I mean, from Emma Whitmore to Emma Martinez. Sarah felt her breath catch. You don't have to do that. Just because we know the biological truth doesn't mean you have to reject everything about the identity you've built. But that's just it, Emma replied, her eyes reflecting the lake's twilight colors. I want to choose my identity for the first time in my life. For 16 years, I've been living inside Richard's lie about who I was. Now I want to live inside my own truth. The legal name change process became their first official act as mother and daughter, conducted at the county courthouse in a small Wisconsin town, where the clerk treated it as routine paperwork rather than a symbolic reclamation of identity. When Emma signed Emma Martinez for the first time,
Sarah felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for 16 years. Carmen visited during their third week of the retreat, bringing updates from Marcus's investigation and news from the ongoing legal proceedings. Richard's defense team is trying to get the recovered memory testimony excluded, she reported, settling at the cabin's small kitchen table. But 3 more victims have come forward with corroborating evidence, including medical records that showed the same suspicious patterns. Emma looked up from her college essay, her expression sharpening with the analytical focus that reminded Sarah of herself. What kind of corroborating evidence? Insurance claims for procedures that were never properly documented, payments to specialized facilities that don't appear in any official medical records, and in 2 cases, children born under suspicious circumstances who were raised by other family members. The information was both validating and horrifying. Sarah's case wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic pattern of exploitation that had been hidden within Chicago's medical establishment for decades. The prosecutor thinks we have enough evidence to convict even without Emma's testimony, Carmen continued. But her testimony would make the case stronger, especially for the charges related to identity theft and child endangerment. Emma set down her pen and looked at Sarah with the kind of direct honesty that had characterized their relationship since learning the truth. I want to testify, not because I have to, but because I want other kids in situations like mine to see that you can stand up to adults who abuse their power. Sarah nodded slowly, pride and fear warring in her chest. Then we'll testify together. As mother and daughter, finally. As autumn deepened around the retreat center, Sarah felt herself changing in ways that went deeper than simply accepting new information about her past. The anxiety that had shadowed her for decades was lifting, replaced by a clarity of purpose that felt both foreign and entirely natural. Emma was changing too, growing into someone who understood her own power while retaining the perceptiveness and humor that had always defined her. They were becoming a family based on choice and truth rather than manipulation and lies. The legal battle would continue, the media attention would persist, and the work of holding Richard and his enablers accountable was far from finished. But here, beside a Wisconsin lake, watching her daughter plan her future with the confidence of someone who finally knew her own history, Sarah Martinez felt something she'd never experienced before. The peace of living authentically in her own life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.